Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from today. If this is your first time exploring the channel, or if you haven't subscribed yet, please support us by hitting the subscribe button. It truly means a lot to us. Thank you so much. The sterile, cold hum of the airport lounge echoed in the background, a constant reminder of the frustrating hours that Lisa and her daughter Lily had spent waiting. The large windows framed a dreary scene of darkening skies, while the flicker of overhead lights only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Lisa shifted her weight in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her eyes scanning the arrivals and departures board. Still no change. The flight had been delayed for what felt like an eternity. "Mommy, why aren't we flying yet?" Lily's voice, high-pitched and filled with innocent curiosity, broke through Lisa's swirling thoughts. Lisa forced a smile and turned her attention back to her daughter, trying to hide her own mounting frustration. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes these things take time." Lily's small fingers clutched a brightly colored crayon, drawing wide strokes across a page in her coloring book. The edges of her drawing were messy, but to Lisa, it was perfect. Her daughter's wide eyes glowed with excitement, oblivious to the tension in the air. Lisa sighed, her gaze falling back to the gate where the plane still stood unmoving, just beyond her reach. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and Lisa glanced over her shoulder. An elderly man shuffled down the aisle, his body bent slightly with age and his limp dragging with each uneven step. He carried a worn carry-on bag, struggling with the weight. The noise of his struggles was suddenly interrupted by a loud, sharp voice. "Watch where you're going. Do you even know what you're doing?" The voice belonged to a man dressed in a suit that screamed wealth. He narrowed his eyes at the elderly man, his expression twisted into a grimace of disdain. The elderly man, apologetic and embarrassed, mumbled, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Lisa's breath hitched in her throat. The wealthy man's words hung in the air, like a bad taste in her mouth. She could feel the injustice pulsing through her veins, but she bit her tongue, holding back the words that were already building inside her. She turned her attention to Lily, hoping her daughter wouldn't sense the anger rising in her chest. It was then that the elderly man attempted to stow his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. His hands trembled, struggling to lift it, and the bag slipped from his grip, tumbling down. The crash it made was sharp, louder than Lisa had expected. It hit the wealthy man square in the chest, jolting him from his seat. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Are you trying to kill someone with that bag?" The wealthy man's face turned crimson as he glared at the elderly man, the tension around them thickening like smoke in the air. The elderly man stammered, I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "Do they let people like you on planes?" The wealthy man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a danger to everyone around you." Lisa's pulse quickened. She could feel her blood boiling, her fists clenching at her sides. "I can't stay silent any longer," she thought, her eyes flicking back to Lily, who was now absorbed in her coloring book, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. Lisa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor with a sharp screech. Before she could speak, the flight attendant's voice broke through, soft but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now preparing for takeoff." The moment passed, but Lisa's resolve did not waver. As she sat back down, the elderly man beside her looked embarrassed, his eyes averted. This was far from over, Lisa told herself. As the hum of the plane's engines began to fill the cabin, the brief but sharp tension in the air seemed to settle, if only momentarily. Lisa's eyes flicked to Lily, who had already curled up in her seat, her small head resting against the window, lost in a world of colors. But Lisa's mind remained tangled in the events that had just unfolded. Why do people have to be so cruel? she thought, biting her lip to suppress the anger still simmering beneath her skin. The flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, offering the usual polite smiles, while Lisa's gaze shifted again to the elderly man now seated across the aisle from them. He had settled into his chair with a slow, deliberate motion, his fingers trembling as they gripped the armrest. His gray hair, thinning at the temples, reflected the dull light of the cabin, his posture stooped with years of wear and struggle. Despite his age, there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. Just as the last few passengers began to settle in, the elderly man's labored breathing was interrupted by a slight shuffle of movement in the aisle. A young man, perhaps no older than 25, dressed in a suit that appeared to be crafted from the finest materials, entered the cabin with an air of superiority. He walked with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him something, his steps echoing in the otherwise muted cabin. As the young man passed, the elderly man, struggling with his bag once again, leaned forward to retrieve it from the floor. The sound of his movements was almost drowned by the click of the seatbelt signs and the soft hum of the aircraft in motion. But then it happened. The elderly man's hand brushed against the young man's shoulder, inadvertently causing him to jolt slightly. "Watch where you're going," the young man barked, his voice dripping with disdain. His eyes, sharp and judgmental, locked onto the elderly man as if he were some nuisance that had disrupted his well-planned day. "Do you even know where you are?" The elderly man's face flushed with embarrassment. He mumbled something inaudible, clearly flustered by the harsh rebuke. His limp was more pronounced now as he tried to regain his composure, struggling to keep his dignity intact in the face of such callousness. Lisa felt the all-too-familiar spark of anger flare inside her chest once again, but before she could react, she noticed the wealthy man, a few rows ahead, turning in his seat to glare at the elderly man. The disgust in his eyes was unmistakable. "Just go sit somewhere else," the wealthy man sneered, his voice rising enough for several others to overhear. "Nobody wants to sit next to someone like you." Lisa's grip tightened on the armrest, her knuckles turning white. Her jaw clenched as her heart raced, each beat pounding in her ears like a drum. She glanced at Lily, who, thankfully, had fallen asleep, oblivious to the uncomfortable situation unfolding around them. Lisa took a deep breath. "Not this time," she thought. "Not this time will I stay quiet." As the elderly man shuffled into his seat with painstaking effort, Lisa's eyes locked onto his for a moment. His gaze was steady but tired, as though life had worn him down over the years, but still, there was a glimmer of resilience in the deep lines etched into his face. Despite everything, he had survived this long. That in itself was something worthy of respect. But it was the moment that followed, the moment when Lisa rose from her seat and crossed the aisle to the elderly man, that would mark the beginning of something unexpected. The low hum of the plane seemed to fade as Lisa's thoughts tightened around the scene playing out before her. She could feel the anger bubbling just beneath her skin, threatening to surface. The elderly man across the aisle was still struggling with his carry-on bag, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to place it in the overhead compartment. With each attempt, the bag seemed to fight back, slipping from his grasp, causing him to wince in frustration. Lisa's gaze never wavered from him as she leaned slightly forward in her seat. She couldn't understand how anyone, especially the man sitting just ahead, arrogantly clutching his briefcase, could be so cold-hearted. She watched as the elderly man, despite his clear discomfort, tried again, his breathing shallow as he lifted the heavy bag. His fingers, once steady in youth, now betrayed him, slipping on the handle, the bag jerking in his hand. And then it happened. The bag, no. After one last failed attempt to find its place, slipped free from its hands and fell, slowly, almost in slow motion, toward the row where the wealthy man sat. The sound of it crashing down on the floor, followed by a sickening thud as it collided with the man's leg, broke through the heavy silence. For a split second, everything seemed to pause. The elderly man's face twisted with embarrassment, his cheeks flushed as though every eye in the cabin were on him. The wealthy man, however, didn't seem to hesitate. His reaction was instant, explosive. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Are you trying to kill someone with that bag?" His voice was louder now, shrill, as he recoiled from the blow, glaring at the elderly man with a look of pure contempt. His expensive suit looked as if it had been insulted by the mere proximity of the man, his lips curling into a sneer. The elderly man looked utterly defeated. He stood frozen for a moment, his eyes not meeting the wealthy man's gaze. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The wealthy man, clearly not satisfied with the apology, leaned forward in his seat, his face contorted with rage. "Why do they let people like you on planes? You're a danger to everyone around you." His words were venomous, each syllable like a slap in the face to the frail, aging man who simply looked away, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. Lisa could feel her chest tighten, a knot of disgust twisting in her stomach. "This is too much," she thought. "I can't just sit here." Her gaze flickered back to Lily, who thankfully remained asleep, unaware of the ugliness unfolding before them. If you find the story we bring today interesting, please comment "great." If you feel the story is not attractive, please comment "need more drama." The wealthy man's insults grew louder as he muttered under his breath about the elderly man's smell. "I can't sit here next to someone who reeks like a hospital. This is disgusting." Lisa felt a wave of cold fury surge through her, but it was not the kind that would let her back down. Without thinking, she stood up from her seat, her movements sharp and deliberate. Every part of her wanted to lash out, to make the man understand the cruelty of his words. Her voice, though steady, rang clear as she spoke. "This man deserves respect, not your insults," she snapped, her words cutting through the murmurs of the surrounding passengers. The wealthy man's gaze shifted toward her, eyes narrowing. "Who do you think you are, defending him?" Lisa's face remained calm, but inside, a storm raged. "It's everyone's business when someone is being treated unfairly," she replied, her tone unwavering. She took a step toward the elderly man, feeling her heart quicken as she saw him glance at her with wide, surprised eyes. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension between the two men and the space between them. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. "This man is a veteran who fought to protect this country. He deserves our respect, not your scorn," Lisa said, her voice firm and loud enough for the entire row to hear. Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment the only sound was the quiet hum of the plane's engines. The wealthy man's face reddened, his pride clearly wounded. He opened his mouth to say something, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he crossed his arms, glaring at the elderly man with contempt, though now perhaps with less conviction. Lisa, however, wasn't done. She knew she had to do more, to show that kindness and respect still existed in a world that seemed to value neither. Without another word, she turned to the elderly man, who had grown quiet, his eyes still downcast. "Would you like to sit here?" Lisa offered, her voice soft but firm. You deserve a comfortable place. You can sit here, and Lily and I will move." The elderly man looked at her, confusion crossing his weathered face. "Thank you, miss. You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice cracking slightly, his gratitude evident. Lisa smiled gently. "It's the least we can do. You deserve to travel comfortably." She turned to Lily, who had awoken from her nap, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Lily, we're going to let this gentleman sit here. You'll sit in my lap." As they moved, Lisa couldn't help but feel a small, quiet satisfaction, a sense of rightness in the midst of the chaos that had erupted. The air in the cabin seemed thick, as if the tension was suspended around them like an invisible fog. Lisa could feel it, the weight of the stares from other passengers, the suffocating pressure of the moment. She stood there, her body rigid with the kind of anger that had been building up since the moment the wealthy man had started to belittle the elderly man. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, her resolve was unshakable. The wealthy man, now glaring at Lisa, leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed in a defensive posture, but his face betrayed the underlying contempt. "Who do you think you are?" His voice dripped with derision, every word laced with arrogance. "Defending him? Do you really believe he deserves your pity?" Lisa's gaze was steady as she faced him, her expression a sharp contrast to the wealthy man's sneering one. "I think he deserves respect," she replied, her voice cutting through the air with surprising calmness. There was no hesitation in her words, no waver of doubt. She had reached the breaking point, and there was no turning back now. "You really want to fight me over this?" The wealthy man's voice rose, now tinged with an edge of disbelief. His finger jabbed in the direction of the elderly man, still sitting quietly in the seat Lisa had offered him. "For someone like him, what's next? Should I start paying my respects to every homeless person I come across?" Lisa took a step forward, the sound of her heels clicking firmly against the cabin floor, slicing through the tension like a knife. The plane seemed to hum around her, but for that brief moment, the world outside the conversation disappeared. All that mattered was the elderly man's dignity and the wrongness of the situation. "No," Lisa's voice was firm, her tone unwavering. "You should be paying respect to people like him because they've earned it. He fought in wars. He fought for your freedom, and what do? You mock him for struggling with his bag." Her words rang out, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, but her focus remained solely on the man in front of her, who was now visibly uncomfortable. The contrast was stark. Lisa stood tall, her shoulders squared, her face set in a mask of determination. The wealthy man, by contrast, seemed to shrink into his seat, his earlier bravado slipping away like sand through his fingers. For a moment, he looked almost unsure, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for something to say, but nothing came. Lisa wasn't finished. She wasn't about to let this go. Her eyes never left his as she spoke again, more quietly this time, but with an intensity that cut deeper than the first words. "Respect isn't something you give out of charity. It's something you owe. To everyone, regardless of their status, their wealth, or their struggles. You don't get to decide who deserves it based on your own narrow view of the world." Her voice trembled, but not with fear. This was the tremor of righteous anger, a raw emotion that sparked from deep within her chest. The cabin was silent now, all eyes on them. The rich man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his previous smug expression faltering, replaced by something closer to shame, though it was fleeting, and Lisa knew it wouldn't last. She didn't care. What mattered was that, for one brief, shining moment, he was forced to confront the consequences of his behavior. Lisa took a breath, her chest rising and falling steadily as she finally broke the silence. "This man deserves better than your scorn. I won't stand by while you treat him like this." She turned her gaze toward the elderly man, who was still sitting quietly, his eyes downcast, but there was a flicker of something in his tired gaze, something like gratitude, though it was difficult to tell through his years of hardship. The wealthy man grumbled under his breath, clearly defeated, his arms uncrossing as he sat back, muttering something about how this was all too much. Lisa didn't wait for him to say anything else. She knew she had done what was right. As she moved back to her seat, a sense of calm settled over her, a calm that didn't come from the absence of conflict, but from the knowledge that she had chosen to act with integrity, to stand up when it was most needed. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted slightly, the tension still there, but somewhat lessened. It was as though in that moment, the moral weight of the situation had finally found a voice. And as Lisa looked down at her daughter still nestled into her seat, she knew that this would be a lesson Lily would carry with her for the rest of her life. A lesson in standing up for what was right. The plane hummed steadily as it soared through the sky, but the tension in the cabin was palpable, thickening with every passing moment. Lisa sat across from Richard, her eyes flicking to the elderly man who now sat comfortably in the seat she had offered. Richard, his back slightly hunched but his face calm, was quietly looking out the window, his hands resting on his lap. For a moment, Lisa felt a peace she hadn't expected. The storm of emotions that had surged within her seemed to settle, until the voice broke through. The wealthy man, still sitting a few rows ahead, was clearly seething. His eyes narrowed as he glared at Richard, though he made no attempt to conceal the disgust plastered across his face. It was as if Richard's very presence was an affront to him, a stain on the pristine world he believed he inhabited. Lisa watched as his lips curled in distaste. "I can't sit here next to someone who smells like a hospital." The wealthy man's words were sharp, louder than necessary, and dripping with contempt. His voice was a cruel sneer, cutting through the quiet hum of the plane like a razor. "It's unbearable. The whole cabin reeks of whatever that is." Lisa's body stiffened at his words, and her eyes locked onto Richard. She saw the brief flicker of hurt that crossed his weathered face, his lips pressing together as if to suppress a sigh. He didn't deserve this. No one did. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker. Richard, a man who had lived through wars, through decades of service and sacrifice, now sitting quietly in the face of cruelty, and the wealthy man, a man whose comfort came from wealth and privilege, using his position to belittle another human being. The contrast felt like a slap in the face, and Lisa's chest tightened with righteous anger. She couldn't just sit here any longer, not after what he had said. Before she could stop herself, she stood up, her movements sharp and deliberate, her voice filled with a quiet fury that echoed through the cabin. "You have no right to speak to him like that," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. The wealthy man turned to her, his eyes flashing with irritation. "And who are you to tell me how to speak?" he sneered, his words dripping with arrogance. "I'm paying for this flight. I deserve a peaceful experience, not this." Lisa took a step forward, her eyes now locked on his with a piercing intensity. The room seemed to shrink as she stood tall, a figure of strength in the midst of the wealthy man's entitlement. "You may have paid for your seat, but that doesn't give you the right to treat someone like him as less than human. He fought for this country. He earned his seat here. What have you done?" Her words sliced through the thick air, leaving no room for debate. The wealthy man's smug expression faltered, and for a split second, Lisa saw something she hadn't expected. Uncertainty. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual condescension. He scoffed, leaning back in his seat as if dismissing her entirely. "People like him shouldn't even be allowed on planes," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting toward Richard with visible disdain. The words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. How could anyone be so blind, so cruel? She glanced at Richard, whose face had remained calm throughout, but she saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the flicker of pain in his eyes. He was holding it together, but it was clear that the insult had stung. But Lisa wasn't done. She couldn't let this go. She turned back to the wealthy man, her voice now colder, sharper, a reflection of the fire burning inside her. You think his worth is determined by how he looks or smells? No. His worth is in the life he's lived, the battles he's fought, and the sacrifices he's made. You'll never understand that, will you? The wealthy man remained silent, his face flushed with anger but too proud to respond. Lisa's gaze lingered for a moment, unwavering, as if daring him to continue, to show the world just how small his view of humanity truly was. With a final glance at Richard, Lisa returned to her seat. She sat down with a deep, steadying breath, her heart still pounding, but her mind clear. The quiet buzz of the plane felt louder now, as if the moment had shifted something in the air. And though the wealthy man didn't say another word, Lisa could feel that the balance of power in the cabin had changed. Not because of anything physical, but because of the words spoken and the respect given. Richard, for his part, looked at her with quiet gratitude in his eyes. A brief, tired smile tugged at his lips, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away, replaced by something stronger than just the weight of old memories, the unspoken bond of mutual respect. Arid not just to the wealthy man, but to every passenger who had been witness to the injustice. And in the silence that followed, Lisa felt a quiet sense of victory. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, offering a small, approving nod to Lisa. The collective weight of the moment seemed to linger in the cabin, but now it was different. It was a moment of unity, of shared belief in something stronger than wealth or power, respect for one another. And as Lisa returned to her seat, taking a deep breath, she knew she had done the right thing. Richard, still sitting across the aisle, offered her a brief but grateful smile, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that words could never fully express. She smiled back, her heart lighter now, knowing that what had started as a small act of defiance had become something much bigger, a statement about dignity, kindness, and the power of standing up for what was right. The tension in the cabin lingered like an aftertaste, heavy and palpable, but slowly, the weight of the confrontation began to lift. Lisa's heartbeat, which had raced through her chest just moments before, now steadied. But there was no denying the lingering sense of righteous fury that still simmered beneath her calm exterior. Her gaze moved back to Richard, who, though silent, seemed to carry a quiet gratitude in his tired eyes. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding of respect and dignity that had finally been restored. Lisa's movements were deliberate as she turned to Lily, who had been too engrossed in her coloring book to fully grasp the weight of the earlier tension. Her small hands gripped the crayon, unaware of the ripple effect the moments before had caused. But Lisa could see the innocence in her daughter's eyes, that unshaken purity that still believed in the goodness of people. For Lily, the world was simple. She believed in right and wrong, good and bad, and she trusted her mother's actions without question. Lisa said softly, her voice now steady, "We're going to let this gentleman sit here." Lily looked up at her, blinking in confusion at first, her crayon still poised mid-air. "But, Mommy, where will we sit?" she asked innocently, her voice light and untroubled, untouched by the storm that had just passed. Lisa's lips curled into a soft smile, her heart swelling with affection for her daughter's trusting nature. "You'll sit on my lap, sweetheart. We'll make it work." Her simple words carried so much weight, so much love and care. As Lisa looked at Richard, still seated across the aisle, she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or a hint of disbelief. Perhaps no one had ever shown him such kindness before, especially from someone who had only just met him. He sat quietly, his hand still resting on his knees, but his eyes met hers with a depth of gratitude that couldn't be easily described. Richard cleared his throat, his voice gruff but sincere. You don't have to do this, miss," he said, his voice softer than it had been earlier, filled with a tenderness that reflected how deeply the kindness had touched him. I've been through a lot in my life, but this is something else. You didn't have to offer me your seat." Lisa shook her head, her gaze unwavering as she met his eyes. "It's the least I can do," she replied, her tone warm, but driven by a moral conviction that resonated deeply within her. "You deserve to travel comfortably, not be subjected to the disrespect of others. No one should ever feel less than because of their age or past." Richard's eyes softened, the lines on his face deepening as he smiled, a small, humble smile that carried more gratitude than words could express. "Thank you," he murmured. "You've reminded me that there's still good in this world." Lisa nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. This moment, this small but significant act of kindness, had forged an unspoken bond between them, one that transcended words. She wasn't just offering her seat. She was offering dignity, respect, and a reminder that humanity could be kind, even in the face of cruelty. As Lisa shifted her body to stand, she felt Lily tug gently at her sleeve, her innocent face filled with curiosity. "Mommy," Lily said quietly, her voice a soft whisper, "do you think Mr. Richard is going to be okay?" Lisa crouched down next to her daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, sweetheart, he'll be just fine, and he's going to be so much more comfortable now." Lily smiled, her eyes bright with the simplicity of a child's understanding. She didn't need to know the complexities of the world to see that what her mother had done was right. Her heart was still pure, untouched by the harshness of life, and that purity radiated in her trust and her simple faith that people were inherently good. As Lisa led her daughter to their new seats, she could feel the warmth of Richard's gaze on her. It was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the bond that had formed, a bond of respect, kindness, and the realization that their shared humanity was more important than any conflict. The world in that moment felt a little less cold. The change in the atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. The other passengers, once silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, seemed to shift in their seats, some exchanging looks of quiet approval. A few even smiled, a small but meaningful gesture that spoke volumes about the ripple effect of kindness. Lisa, with her quiet strength and unwavering sense of justice, had done something powerful, not just for Richard, but for everyone around her. She had turned a moment of cruelty into one of redemption. The hum of the plane seemed to fade into the background as Lisa and Lily settled into their new seats, the weight of the moment still lingering in the air. As the soft chatter of passengers around them slowly resumed, Lisa's thoughts remained fixed on Richard. The kindness she had offered him had created an unexpected connection between them, something deeper than just a shared moment of discomfort. It was as if fate had woven their paths together, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this elderly man than met the eye. Richard sat across the aisle from them, his hands resting on his lap, his face turned slightly toward the window as he watched the clouds drift by. For a long time he had been quiet, his demeanor calm yet distant, as if he carried the weight of years in his bones. But there was something about him, something that had tugged at Lisa's curiosity ever since their first exchange. His eyes, though tired, held a depth that seemed to speak of untold stories, of experiences that spanned decades. Lisa glanced over at him again, her heart full of questions. The curiosity had been building within her, and now, with the quiet of the flight wrapping around them, she felt compelled to ask. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but curious. "Richard," she said, her tone soft yet filled with a quiet urgency. "I couldn't help but notice your hat earlier. It's not just any military insignia, is it? Were you in the military?" Richard's eyes shifted slightly, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. His lips parted as if he was carefully considering how to respond, and then, with a slow exhale, he nodded, and the weight of his past settling over him like an old cloak. "Yes, I was," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "I served in World War II and the Korean War, and feels like a lifetime ago now." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The revelation was both startling and poignant. She hadn't expected the answer to be so direct, so matter-of-fact. It was as if the decades of history and hardship that Richard had lived through were suddenly laid bare in that simple sentence. The revelation hung in the air, and Lisa couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the uniform. The man who had fought for a country that often overlooked those who had given so much for it. But before she could ask more, Lily, who had been sitting quietly beside her, piped up with innocent curiosity, her voice full of wonder. "Did you fight in wars, Mr. Richard?" she asked, her eyes wide with a child's untainted interest. Richard's gaze softened, and for the first time a faint smile touched his lips. He looked down at Lily, his eyes filled with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the gruff exterior he had worn earlier. "Yes, I did, little one. I fought in both World War II and the Korean War," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories that spanned more than half a century. "But there's one story I'll never forget. It's about a man I fought alongside, a man named Jack. He saved my life, but he didn't make it out." Lisa's breath caught in her throat, and she leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Richard as she sensed something more beneath his words. The mention of Jack felt like the beginning of something important, something that would shed light on the hidden layers of Richard's past. "What happened to Jack?" Lily asked, her voice soft, almost reverent. Richard's face darkened for a moment as the memory resurfaced, his hands clenching ever so slightly. "Jack was the kind of man who would risk his life for anyone. He saved me during an ambush. He shielded me, took the hit himself." His voice broke slightly as he continued. "He didn't make it, but I survived because of him." There was a long pause, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. Lisa's heart tightened, the realization hitting her like a wave. She felt the connection between Richard's story and her own family growing stronger, a thread weaving through the past and present. "Jack," Lisa whispered, the name echoing in her mind. The moment felt electric, as if everything had shifted into place. Her gaze locked with Richard's, and she felt a spark of recognition, a sense of something familiar rising from the depths of her own history. "I think Jack might have been my grandfather," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the realization. Richard's eyes widened, his face paling slightly as the connection began to form. "Jack? Your grandfather?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "If Jack was your grandfather, then I owe him my life." The revelation hung in the air between them, the sudden connection between Richard and Lisa's family, sending ripples of shock and wonder through both of them. It was as if, after all these years, their histories had finally collided. Two lives, separated by time and circumstance, now linked by the unlikeliest of connections. Lisa's heart raced as the truth began to unfold before her, and in that moment, everything about Richard, the man she had only just met, the stranger who had been so easily dismissed by others, became something more. He was no longer just an elderly man on a plane. He was a piece of her family's history, a connection to the past that had been lost but now, miraculously, was found again. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the weight of the moment settled in, a shared history, a new connection, and a future that held the promise of healing. The hum of the airplane continued to envelop them, but inside the cabin the space between Lisa, Lily, and Richard seemed to shrink, filled with the weight of history and memory. Richard's voice, gravelly and low, broke the silence once again. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with the pain of the past, but tempered by a quiet sense of pride that could never be erased, no matter how many years had passed. "I have never told anyone this," Richard began, his voice steady but full of sorrow. "Not many people know what happened that day, but it's something I can never forget." He shifted slightly in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrest, and Lisa could see the deep lines etched into his face, as if each wrinkle told a story of its own. His eyes, usually so distant, now seemed to hold a distant fire, flickering with memories that refused to fade. Lily, sensing the seriousness in Richard's tone, leaned closer, her innocent curiosity still evident on her young face. She didn't understand the depth of what Richard was saying, but she could tell it was important. Richard cleared his throat before continuing, his voice softer now, the weight of his memories pressing on him. It was during the Korean War. We were ambushed, surrounded on all sides. There was no way out, no chance of surviving. But Jack, he saw what was happening before anyone else did. He knew what we had to do, so he pulled me to safety, taking a bullet in the process. Richard paused, his gaze drifting out the window, as if searching for the words in the vast expanse of the sky. Lisa felt a knot tighten in her chest. She could hear the sorrow in his voice, but there was something else too, something that couldn't be ignored. Despite the heartbreak, there was a deep sense of respect in the way Richard spoke about Jack. His voice, though tinged with grief, was filled with a quiet reverence. He saved my life, but it cost him his. He didn't make it out. I did, and I'll never forget him for that. Lisa swallowed hard, her throat tightening. The pain in Richard's voice was impossible to ignore, but there was something even more powerful than the sorrow. It was the quiet pride, the knowledge that Jack had given everything to save his friend. Richard spoke as though he could still feel the weight of Jack's sacrifice, as though every part of his life had been shaped by that moment. "What happened to him?" Lily asked, her voice a small, innocent question that hung in the air. Her wide eyes looked up at Richard, as if trying to understand the enormity of what he had just shared. Richard looked at Lily, his eyes softening, and for a brief moment, the hardness of his past seemed to melt away. "He didn't make it to see the end of the war," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was a hero, the kind of man who would have done anything for anyone. And I owe him everything I've done since that day. Every choice I've made has been because of him." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Richard's words settled into the hearts of those listening. Lisa felt her own heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and admiration. The strength of his words, the humility in his voice was overwhelming. Richard didn't speak of himself as a hero. He spoke of Jack, the man who had saved him, the man who had sacrificed everything. "And Jack, he would have been proud of you, Richard," Lisa said quietly, her voice filled with quiet sincerity. "I can see it, the way you carry yourself, the way you remember him. You honor his sacrifice every day." Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes reflecting both the weight of his memories and the quiet peace that came with having shared them. The past, though painful, had shaped him, and Lisa could see that the story of Jack, the story of their shared sacrifice, had woven itself into the very fabric of who Richard was. His life, though marked by loss, was also defined by the love and respect he held for his fallen comrade. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Richard didn't need to say anything more. His story had been told, not just to Lisa and Lily, but to himself too. A weight had been lifted, and the connection between them all had deepened. They weren't just strangers on a flight anymore. They were bound by something more profound, a shared understanding of sacrifice, of love, and of the long-lasting impact that history, both personal and collective, had on the human spirit. The quiet hum of the airplane seemed to grow distant as the weight of Richard's words lingered in the air. Lisa sat still, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to process everything he had just shared. The memories Richard had revealed, the sacrifice of Jack, it was overwhelming. Yet, something in his story had started to gnaw at Lisa's mind, a small but insistent thread that tugged at her thoughts, refusing to be ignored. She glanced at Lily, who had fallen silent, her young eyes wide with unspoken understanding. The child's innocence had somehow absorbed the gravity of Richard's story in a way that only someone unburdened by life's complexities could. And yet, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more here, something that had yet to be uncovered. The words that had slipped so naturally from Richard's mouth, their weight, the history behind them, suddenly began to click in Lisa's mind, like the final piece of a puzzle coming into place. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned to Richard, her voice trembling with disbelief as she asked, "Richard, you said Jack saved your life, but you never mentioned his last name. What was it, Jack? What?" Richard paused, his gaze faltering for just a moment. His eyes flickered toward the window, as though he could feel the tension rising between them. The words were right there on the tip of his tongue, but they seemed to hesitate before being spoken. For a long moment, the silence stretched out, thick with the weight of anticipation. Jack Monroe," he said, quietly, as if the name itself carried the echoes of a long-lost memory. His voice dropped almost to a whisper, as if he feared that even speaking it aloud might somehow alter the past. Lisa froze. The world around her seemed to blur, the hum of the plane fading into the background as the truth struck her like a lightning bolt. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The name Monroe reverberated in her mind, louder now, pulling her back to memories she thought were long buried. "Monroe?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. Her heart raced, and her thoughts began to race with it. The connection was undeniable, but the revelation was too much to fully comprehend at first. Her hands trembled as she reached for the armrest, trying to steady herself, but her mind was already spinning. Could it be? Richard looked at her, his brow furrowed, confusion written across his face. "Yes. Jack Monroe. Why?" Lisa's pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, her eyes widening as she pieced together the unimaginable. "My grandfather," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Jack Monroe. That was my grandfather's name. John Monroe." She looked up at Richard, the revelation hitting her with an intensity she hadn't expected. The words hung between them, heavy with history, and Lisa's heart beat faster as she pieced together the fragments of her family's past. Her grandfather, the man she had heard so little about growing up, whose name had been reduced to mere stories and faded photographs, was the same man Richard had fought beside in those wars. He was the same man who had sacrificed so much for his country and for Richard's life. Lisa's hands clutched her chest, feeling the weight of the moment. Her voice was filled with awe, tinged with a sadness she hadn't anticipated. "Richard, your friend, my grandfather, he didn't just fight for freedom, he fought for family, for us." Richard's eyes softened, a deep understanding passing between them. He nodded, slowly, as if in reverence for the connection that had just been made, for the bond that had always existed but had been hidden in the folds of time. "Your grandfather. He was one of the best men I ever knew. He saved my life, Lisa. And now, it feels like I've finally come full circle. Lisa's heart swelled with emotion. She had always known there was a missing piece to her family's story, a void that nothing could fill. But now, standing on the precipice of this revelation, she realized that the missing link wasn't just a name or a date. It was a man who had given his life to protect others, a man whose courage and sacrifice had now touched her life in a way she couldn't have imagined. "Thank you," she whispered to Richard, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing this with me, for helping me understand who he really was." Her eyes glistened with tears, but there was a deep sense of gratitude that shone through. She wasn't just learning about her grandfather's past. She was reconnecting with a piece of her own family, a link to the past that had been lost to time. The connection between the past and the present had never felt more real, and the weight of that realization settled into Lisa's heart, a quiet understanding that history was not just something to be studied, but something to be felt. And in that moment, Lisa knew that this revelation, this connection to Richard's past, was more than just a story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for her family, one built on sacrifice, love, and the enduring bonds that stretched across generations. The car slowly rolled down the quiet street, the air outside warm and soft with the scent of spring. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, the weight of the past and present colliding as Lisa glanced at Richard. His face, usually so stoic, had softened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She could feel it too, the electric current of what was about to unfold. They were on their way to her family's home, specifically to see her grandfather, John Monroe, a man whose presence had been a shadow in Lisa's life, never fully real, but now suddenly very much alive through the connection with Richard. The car stopped in front of a modest house with a flower-lined porch, and Lisa's heart quickened. Richard, however, seemed to hesitate for a moment before opening the door. His age and his history, full of battlefields and loss, had shaped him into a man who seldom showed vulnerability. Yet here he was, standing on the cusp of a moment he had never thought would come. Lisa, sensing his nerves, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay, Richard," she said softly. "He's waiting for you. He'll be glad to see you." Richard nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination, but Lisa could see the glint of something deeper in his eyes, something raw and emotional, a yearning to finally make peace with the past. As they walked to the front door, the soft sound of a door creaking open reached them, and Lisa saw her grandfather standing in the doorway, his posture slightly bent, but his eyes still sharp, his face weathered by time but full of warmth. For a moment it felt like the world stood still. The distance of years, of battles fought and lives lost, collapsed in that single glance between Richard and John. There was no need for words, just the deep, silent recognition of everything they had been through together. It was as if the years had been peeled away, revealing a bond stronger than time itself. "Richard?" John's voice was low but full of disbelief, his eyes widening as he took a hesitant step forward. His weathered hands trembled as they reached out, and for a moment neither man spoke. It was as if the words wouldn't come. Too much history had passed between them to fit neatly into a simple greeting. "Finally, Richard," his voice thick with emotion, whispered. "John, is it really you?" John's face softened, and without warning he stepped forward, his arms opening wide as if to embrace the man he thought he had lost forever. "I never thought I'd see you again," John said, his voice catching as he wrapped Richard in a tight, almost desperate hug. Richard's arms came around him, and for a long moment they stood there, two men, brothers in arms, reunited after decades of separation. The weight of their shared history seemed to settle between them. The sacrifices they had made for each other, the moments they had survived together, now flooding back in an overwhelming rush. Lisa stood back, her own breath catching in her throat as she watched the two men, the deep emotion on their faces undeniable. She had never seen her grandfather like this, his usual calm demeanor replaced with raw, unfiltered emotion. The depth of their bond was impossible to ignore. Her own heart swelled with pride and gratitude as she realized how much this reunion meant for both men. When they finally pulled away, there was a long pause, an unspoken understanding that the words could never fully capture what they had just experienced. Richard, his voice hoarse, looked at John with a mixture of admiration and wonder. "You saved my life," he said quietly, "and I owe you everything." John shook his head, his eyes filled with both humility and something deeper, gratitude for the life that had been given to him, the life he had fought so hard to preserve. "We saved each other," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what we did, Richard. We saved each other." The air was thick with the weight of their words, but there was also a profound peace settling over them, the kind that only comes with the healing of old wounds. Lisa stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I think he would have been proud, Richard," she said, looking at her grandfather with tears in her eyes. "He would have been proud to know how much you meant to each other." John's gaze softened as he looked at her, and he nodded slowly, his hand reaching out to gently squeeze Lisa's. "I know he would have, Lisa. I know." In that moment, all the pain of the past seemed to dissipate, leaving only the quiet strength of their friendship, their sacrifices, and the love that had carried them through the years. The reunion wasn't just about two men reconnecting. It was about the restoration of a bond that transcended time, distance, and loss, something deeper than blood and more lasting than history. And for the first time in many years, it felt like everything had come full circle. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow through the window, bathing the room in a quiet, comforting light. Inside, the air felt heavy but filled with a sense of peace. Peace that had been a long time coming. Richard sat in the armchair, his hands resting on his lap as he looked across the room at John. The two men had spent hours talking, their voices soft but full of life, as though each conversation was stitching together the years they had lost. Lisa sat beside her grandfather, her heart full as she watched the two men reconnect, sharing memories from the past. Some happy, some painful, but all a testament to the bond they had formed. Richard, once a stranger to her, had now become a link to a past she had only heard about in stories. A link to the grandfather she had never really known, yet felt an unexplainable connection to. John, with his weathered hands, had pulled out an old photo album from the shelf, pages yellowed with age but still full of vivid memories. "This was taken after we got back from Korea," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Right after the war ended. We didn't know what to expect when we got back, but we were just happy to be alive." Richard, his voice soft, leaned forward to look at the photograph. His eyes were distant, as though lost in the memory of that time. There's absolutely no justifying this situation, but it presented a symbolic opportunity for us to clean slate. Lisa's eyes flickered between them as she saw the unspoken connection in the way they exchanged glances, the shared memories, the quiet understanding. She could see the pain in their eyes, but there was something else too, a profound sense of relief. The years of separation, the weight of loss, and the sacrifices they had made for one another had not erased the bond they shared. If anything, it had only strengthened it. "Do you remember that night in the trenches?" John asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We thought we weren't going to make it, But somehow, we did. You kept me going, Richard. I don't think I would have made it without you." Richard smiled softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was never about making it alone, John. We were in it together. We always were." The warmth of their words filled the room, enveloping them in a shared sense of belonging, of gratitude for the connection that had been tested by time and war but never broken. Lisa watched them with a quiet smile, her heart swelling with appreciation for this moment, the moment when the past and the present finally merged, bringing them all together in this small, unspoken way. As the evening drew to a close, Richard stood up from his chair, his movements slower now with age but still strong in their purpose. He looked at John, then at Lisa, and with a deep sigh, he crossed the room and placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "For saving my life, for being my brother. I'll never forget it. Not as long as I live." John's face softened, and without a word, he reached out and pulled Richard into an embrace. It wasn't just a hug. It was the quiet exchange of everything they had been through, everything they had lost, and everything they had found in each other. The kind of embrace that spoke louder than words ever could. Lisa, her heart full, stepped back slightly, allowing the men their moment. She wiped a tear from her cheek, touched by the raw emotion that had surfaced in that simple gesture. She had never seen her grandfather like this, never seen him so vulnerable, so open with his feelings. It was a side of him she had never known, and it made her appreciate him and Richard even more.